never an completely, utterly articulate, and he didn't have a note in front of him. And after he'd spoken for a couple minutes of this, I started laughing to myself, not out loud, that would have been embarrassing. I started laughing to myself, and it wasn't the laughing of poking fun, it was just the laughing of utter astonishment that someone could do this. So that was my first exposure to Richard. I don't recall when we first asked him to write an article for Reason magazine, but I do remember that whenever we did ask him, he was always very willing and cooperative. And he never acted like a prima donna, so he was wonderful to work with. I've had the same experience with him at the Institute for Humane Studies. Richard is on our academic review committee for our fellowship program for graduate students. And he's always one of the first professors on the review committee to return his comments on the several finalists that we ask him to judge. He's also always eager to help us in our programs to develop young scholars who will go on to pursue academic legal careers. At a conference several years ago, one of our weekends like this, where we had law students around who are going to become academics, Richard was among the faculty there who was to comment on students' presentations. And I looked over halfway through a student's talk and saw Richard's head. And I thought, oh no, Richard is falling asleep. He'd come in from Chicago for this, and it would be understandable, but I was concerned. The student finished his presentation, Richard's head popped up, and out came his usual very astute comments on the presentation that he just heard. And I'm sure that the student wished that Richard had fallen asleep. But I am deeply appreciative of Richard's willingness and to help young scholars, so that he's not just contributing to the world's understanding of the ideas of liberty, but helping to develop the next generation of explorers and defenders of these ideas. So I thought it would be more interesting to tell you a couple little stories about Richard tonight. His formal bona fides are in your program. He is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1972. He holds and has held a number of other appointments, editorships of journals, and honors. Simple Rules for a Complex World, I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, and Richard's most recent book, Skepticism and Freedom, A Modern Case for Classical Liberalism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an articulate defender of the ideas of liberty, Richard.
It is indeed a great pleasure to be here tonight, to be here among so many friends, both old and new. I started out in Southern California. Jim Gray, who's here tonight, was one of the first students in my first class in 1968. Known Manny Claus and many other people here for so many years that I can scarcely remember. And I have to say, it's always nice to come home. And so it's a real honor to be here, and it's a real honor to speak to you. And what I'm going to talk to you about is something that should be just a bit unsettling. What I'm going to address is the question of the latent ambiguities in the title of this foundation, to start to indicate the philosophical inconsistencies which are capable of rendering it in two. Oh, you say, we should be very, very nervous about such a speech. No, you should not, because in fact, out of this kind of tension comes strength, and out of strength comes the ability to influence the world and to create progress in it. When we talk about reason, we can use the term in two senses. On the one hand, we can talk about it with a big old capital R and treat it as though it's a form of logical deduction in which a proposition has reason behind it if you cannot deny it except upon pain of self-contradiction. When you speak about reason in this particular sense, and you're talking about politics, you're always talking about those things which are necessary necessarily true because they cannot be otherwise. And in many cases, if you cannot give a deductive explanation for why they are necessarily true, you can appeal to principles of self-evidence and natural law in order to clinch the case that it is such. And that's one way in which the term has been used, and it is a way in which, in fact, has led to enormous amounts of advances in human freedom, because it was on such naive principles that the ancient scholars who cared about freedom were able to attack such institutions as slavery, and on a certain class of questions, having a strong, stubborn, absolutist moral backbone is, in fact, the best way to secure progress in the world at large. But there's a second sense in which one starts to speak about reason, and the Reason Foundation, to some extent, embodies that as well. When Marty introduced me, she gave a well-deserved praise to Bob Poole, and she gave him the highest compliment of all. She said, he's a reasonable man. Now, what is it that we mean by reasonable in that sense that we don't mean by reasonable in the former sense? What we mean by reasonable in this particular way is that the way in which you decide what is right or wrong in a particular case is to make very complicated empirical judgments about how the world operates, which you will hope will lead you to be able to suggest some modest incremental improvements over the status quo. You recognize intrinsically that you're not in a situation where you're the only person who has a hand on the rudder that judges and moves the world, and what you try to do is to be able to persuade people, often people who have fundamentally different views of yours, as to the soundness of your incremental proposals. But of course, there is something wrong with incrementalism, because all that suggests to you is that you're dealing with a situation in which you're trying to go from here to there, and it is not a principle or a set of rules which will tell you how, if you could organize society from scratch, it ought to be done. And so the great question that one always has to worry about is how you reconcile these two senses of reasonable. The one that talks about, rather, reason, the one that talks about reason as being a series of necessary truths, and the other one which more modestly talks about reason as a sense of those truths which are ordinarily true, but are not necessarily so. And in dealing with this particular proposition, it seems to me here that the way is, moreover, extremely important that we undertake this particular mission, because there is no question when one starts to look at the way in which academic and public discourse takes place, the traditional arguments that have been made in favor of libertarian truths have run into all sorts of opposition from many, many quarters. We may take these truths to be self-evident, but other people will say, in effect, that there are other sets of truths that are self-evident. We may believe that each individual owns the talents that are his or hers and uniquely his or hers, but other people may believe that all individual talents are arbitrarily distributed and it's only a matter of luck and fortune that makes one person able, and so therefore the state ought to come along and redress those natural imbalances by the use of public force. We therefore have to figure out how it is that we can construct our intuitions in such a way that give us the core beliefs that we care about and meet the intellectual opposition that we face from opposite directions. How is it that we ought to do so? Well, here I think in solving these problems, we ought to take a strong leaf from the traditional version of libertarian theory, which says that before you sweat the large stuff, figure out if you can solve the small stuff, and work by cautious increments from simple situations to more complicated situations, seeing what gets preserved and what gets lost along the way. Now, the simplest possible transaction that can involve social conflict or social cooperation is a transaction that involves two and only two people. How ought we to start to think about these transactions? Well, the first thing we ought to do when we think about these transactions is to ask ourselves about the set of motivations and psychological attributes that all people bring to the kinds of decisions that they make in the world at large. And there is a part of human nature which is rather unlovely, and there is a part of human nature which in effect accounts for huge amounts of the creativity. And unfortunately, the unlovely and the creative parts both stem from the same basic force, which is that of individual self-interest. And the question is, what this does in effect is that under some circumstances, it leads to destructive behavior, and in some circumstances, it leads to cooperative behavior. What are the conditions that account for this? Well, in the simplest situation, if you could have a world in which these two people can transact voluntarily, and each of them has self-interest in the sense that I have defined, the thing that is most important, the 11th commandment that everyone who